In the spring of 1944, a Luftwaffe pilot sat in a briefing room somewhere in occupied France. He had survived 2 years of combat. He had shot down Allied bombers over the Channel. He knew his aircraft. He knew his enemy. And when intelligence officers showed him photographs of a new American fighter, he laughed. It was a joke that would cost thousands of lives. This is the story of arrogance, of certainty, of how the most experienced fighter pilots in the world looked at their opponents and saw nothing but weakness. How they mocked aircraft that seemed too big, too heavy, too strange to ever threaten the mastery of the Luftwaffe. And how, one by one, those same aircraft tore that certainty apart. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was not a beautiful aircraft. It weighed 7 tons when fully loaded. It had a radial engine that gave it the profile of a flying milk bottle. American pilots called it the Jug because of its shape. British ground crews called it other things, most of them unprintable. When the first P-47s arrived in England in late 1942, German intelligence took notice. Reconnaissance photographs were analyzed, specifications were estimated, reports were filed. And in fighter bases across occupied Europe, experienced Luftwaffe pilots looked at those reports and felt something close to relief. The reasoning seemed sound. The P-47 was enormous. It was heavier than any single-engine fighter they had ever encountered. The math was simple. Weight meant sluggishness. Size meant drag. A fighter that heavy could not turn, could not climb, could not possibly compete with the lightweight, nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. German tactical doctrine had been refined over years of combat. Dogfighting favored tight turns and rapid climbs. The Bf-109 excelled at both. The Fw-190 could outturn almost anything in the sky. Against such aircraft, the Thunderbolt seemed like a grotesque mistake. An American blunder born from industrial excess and engineering ignorance. Some German pilots openly mocked it. They called it the flying bathtub. Others suggested it was evidence that America still did not understand air combat, that despite their industrial might, they lacked the experience, the knowledge, the tactical sophistication that only years of war could provide. The first encounters seemed to confirm these assumptions. In early 1943, P-47s began flying escort missions over Europe. Initial engagements were cautious. American pilots new to combat often broke off when attacked. German pilots reported easy victories. The Thunderbolt, they said, was exactly what they expected. Slow to respond, unwilling to turn, preferring to dive away rather than fight. But something was happening that German intelligence officers did not immediately recognize. The P-47s that dove away were not running. They were learning. American tactical doctrine began to shift. Pilots stopped trying to turn with Bf-109s. They stopped accepting fights on German terms. Instead, they used what the Thunderbolt actually was. Not a dogfighter, not a turner, but something else entirely. A machine built around raw power. The P-47's enormous engine produced more than 2,000 horsepower. Its heavy weight in a dive became an advantage. It could accelerate past anything the Luftwaffe flew, and once it reached high speed, its thick wings and robust controls remained stable when German fighters began to shake apart. The new American tactic was simple. Gain altitude, dive at high speed, fire, extend away, climb back to altitude, repeat. Boom and zoom, they called it. For pilots trained in the elegant, swirling dogfights of the Eastern and Western fronts, this was not real fighting. It seemed cowardly, unsporting, but it worked. By mid-1943, the casualty reports began to shift. Luftwaffe pilots who pursued diving P-47s found themselves in unwinnable situations. The Thunderbolt accelerated away. German fighters, straining to keep pace, often lost control at high speeds or pulled so hard their airframes failed. And when Bf-109s tried to escape by diving, the P-47 followed, caught up, and opened fire. The mockery began to fade. Intelligence reports changed their tone. The word dangerous appeared more frequently. Tactical briefings emphasized caution. Avoid extended dives. Do not chase at high speed. Break off early. The flying bathtub had become a problem, but the psychological damage went deeper than tactics. German pilots had built their confidence on technological superiority, on the idea that their aircraft, their training, their experience made them untouchable. The P-47 challenged none of those assumptions directly. It simply ignored them. It did not try to be a better Bf-109. It was something different, something heavier and stranger and built around principles that seemed wrong, and it worked anyway. By 1944, the P-47 had achieved something no other Allied fighter had managed. It had forced the Luftwaffe to change how it fought, to abandon tactics that had worked for years, to accept that the rules had changed. The jug was no longer funny. But the transformation of the P-47 from object of mockery to instrument of dominance was only beginning. In January 1944, the strategic air campaign over Europe entered a new phase. American bomber formation struck deeper into Germany. The industrial heartland, the synthetic oil refineries, the aircraft factories, and with them came waves of P-47 Thunderbolts, their silver wings catching the winter sun as they climbed to altitude. German fighter pilots, gathering at forward bases in France and the Low Countries, watched these formations with growing unease. The numbers were wrong. Too many, too organized, too relentless. Day after day, the American bombers came, and the Thunderbolts came with them. Luftwaffe tactical planning had always relied on certain assumptions, that fighters could be concentrated against specific threats, that losses could be replaced through training programs and factory output, that experienced pilots using superior tactics could impose disproportionate casualties on less skilled opponents. The P-47 challenged all of these assumptions simultaneously. Its range, initially limited, had been extended through the use of external drop tanks. Thunderbolts that could barely reach the German border in 1943 were now escorting bombers to targets 400 miles inside the Reich. The safe zones where German fighters could regroup and refuel no longer existed. More critically, the Americans had refined their escort tactics. P-47 groups no longer stayed close to bomber formations. They ranged ahead. They swept the skies. They positioned themselves between German airfields and the approaching bomber streams. When Luftwaffe fighters took off, climbing to attack altitude, they often found Thunderbolts already above them. The psychological reversal was profound. German pilots had spent years perfecting the art of the bounce, the surprise attack from altitude, diving on unsuspecting opponents with speed and altitude advantage. It was the fundamental tactic of air combat, the predator's approach. Now they were the prey. Sound, engine noise fading to silence. In March 1944, a Jagdgeschwader based near Hanover received new tactical orders. When engaging American escort fighters, do not pursue below 10,000 feet. Maintain altitude advantage at all costs. Break off engagement if outnumbered. These were defensive orders, the language of an air force that had lost the initiative. The pilots who read those orders understood what they meant. The Luftwaffe was no longer hunting, it was surviving. But survival required engaging. The bombers had to be stopped, or at least disrupted. And the only way to reach the bombers was through the fighters, through the Thunderbolts. German pilots developed new formations, larger groups to counter American numerical superiority, specific attack profiles designed to minimize exposure to P-47 firepower, plans that looked good in briefing rooms but collapsed under the pressure of actual combat. Because the Americans were learning faster than the Germans could adapt. Every mission produced data, gun camera footage, combat reports, tactical analyses. The Americans studied this information with industrial efficiency. They identified what worked and what failed. They refined their approaches. They shared lessons across groups. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent system. Knowledge remained local. Tactical innovations stayed with the pilots who developed them. And as those pilots died, their experience died with them. By spring 1944, the average experience level of German fighter pilots had declined dramatically. Veterans with hundreds of combat missions flew alongside teenagers with barely 50 hours in type. The institutional knowledge that had made the Luftwaffe dominant was evaporating. The P-47 groups, meanwhile, were becoming more experienced. Pilots who had arrived in England in 1943, uncertain and untested, now had 50 or 60 combat missions. They understood their aircraft. They understood German tactics. They flew with the confidence that came from surviving and learning. German intelligence officers noted this shift with alarm. Reports described American fighter pilots who maneuvered aggressively, who did not break off when attacked, who pursued German fighters with a determination that bordered on reckless. This was not supposed to happen. American pilots were supposed to be inferior, less skilled, less aggressive. Their only advantage was numbers and industrial capacity. But the pilots in the combat reports were not fighting like inferiors. German pilots had grown accustomed to fighters armed with a mix of machine guns and cannons. The Bf-109 carried 1 cannon and 2 machine guns. The FW-190 might carry 4 cannons and 2 machine guns. These were precise weapons, deadly when they hit, but they required careful aim, limited ammunition, discipline. The P-47 carried 8 machine guns and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. American pilots could hold the trigger for extended bursts. They could fire from greater distances. They could walk their tracers into target. The sheer volume of fire compensated for less precise aim. German pilots reported a new kind of combat, where American fighters did not need perfect deflection shots, where they could spray enough bullets that some inevitably hit, where the sky filled with tracers and you could not maneuver without flying through streams of fire. This was industrial warfare applied to dogfighting. Not elegant, not artistic, but devastatingly effective. A Bf-109 hit by a single 20mm cannon shell might be crippled, but it might survive, might make it home. But a Bf-109 hit by 20 or 30 50 caliber rounds, tearing through wings and fuselage and engine, did not survive. The difference was psychological as much as practical. German pilots could accept being outmaneuvered. That was skill. Bad luck, circumstance. But being overwhelmed by sheer firepower, by an opponent who could afford to waste ammunition because they had so much, was demoralizing in a different way. It represented a kind of warfare where individual skill mattered less than systemic advantages, where the better pilot might still lose because the enemy could afford to make mistakes that you could not. By summer 1944, Luftwaffe fighter commands began issuing orders that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Avoid combat with enemy fighters unless circumstances are favorable. Priority is bomber interception. If engaged by escorts, break off and attempt to reach bombers from another angle. These orders acknowledged a truth that could not be officially admitted. The Luftwaffe could no longer defeat American escort fighters in sustained combat. The strategic calculation had become purely mathematical. Each German fighter destroyed was difficult to replace. Each pilot killed took months or years of experience with him. The Americans, meanwhile, suffered losses that would have crippled any European air force and simply absorbed them. Fresh pilots, fresh aircraft, fresh groups rotating into combat. The Eastern Front had taught German pilots what attrition warfare looked like on the ground. The endless Soviet offensives, the attacks that kept coming regardless of casualties, the sense that you could win every tactical engagement and still lose the strategic war. Now, they were experiencing the same thing in the air. The P-47, more than any other aircraft, embodied this reality. It was not the best fighter in any single category. The late-model Bf-109s were faster at certain altitudes. The FW-190 could outturn it under specific conditions. German jets, when they appeared, were vastly superior in speed. But the Thunderbolt was there, always there, in numbers that made individual superiority irrelevant. A German pilot might shoot down a P-47, might celebrate that victory, might report it at debriefing and receive congratulations, and the next day he would face 10 more, and the day after that, 20, and they would still be there when he died. In July 1944, the P-47's role expanded beyond pure fighter escort. American commanders recognized that the Thunderbolt's rugged construction made it ideal for ground attack. Its massive engine could absorb damage. Its airframe could handle the stress of low-altitude operations, and its 8 machine guns could shred ground targets. Fighter-bomber variants began carrying bombs and rockets. Missions shifted from high-altitude escort to low-altitude strikes. German airfields, rail yards, supply columns, anything that moved in daylight became a target. For German pilots, this created a new nightmare. Your airfield was no longer safe. Taking off or landing, you were vulnerable. P-47s might appear at any moment, strafing down the runway, destroying aircraft before they could even leave the ground. Some pilots described the sound of thunderbolts at low altitude, the massive radial engine producing a distinctive roar. When you heard that sound, you ran. To shelters, to tree lines, anywhere away from your aircraft, because if the thunderbolts caught you in the open, you died. Ground crews suffered even more psychological trauma. They watched aircraft they had maintained, repaired, prepared for combat, destroyed in seconds by strafing runs. They pulled dead pilots from burning cockpits. They counted the holes in aircraft that managed to return. And they knew that tomorrow the thunderbolts would come again. The Americans called these operations armed reconnaissance, a clinical term for hunting anything German that moved. P-47 pilots flew low over the French and German countryside looking for targets of opportunity. A truck, a train, a staff car, anything. The campaign created a situation where German forces could barely move in daylight. Supply convoys traveled at night. Troop movements happened under cover of darkness. The entire German military infrastructure in Western Europe bent around the simple fact that if you moved during the day, American fighters would find you. And often, those fighters were P-47s. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots who witnessed this was complex. They had joined the Luftwaffe to be fighter pilots, to engage in aerial combat, to win victories through skill and courage. But increasingly, their role was to watch helplessly as American fighters destroyed German ground forces, because engaging those fighters meant dying. A Bf-109, low on fuel after climbing to intercept bombers, could not afford to dogfight with a P-47 at low altitude. The Thunderbolt, with fuel to spare, would simply out-sustain you, wait for you to run dry, then kill you as you glided toward your airfield. German pilots began to internalize a bitter truth. They could not protect their own forces, could not prevent the systematic destruction of German military capability. They could only watch and survive and hope that something, somewhere, would change the strategic situation. Nothing changed. By August 1944, Allied forces had broken out from Normandy. The invasion that German forces had failed to stop was rolling east, and above the advancing armies, P-47s flew constant patrols, interdicting, destroying, dominating. The Luftwaffe's response was increasingly desperate. Inexperienced pilots, rushed through training, were thrown into combat. Many died on their first missions. Some never even saw the American fighters that killed them. They simply appeared in the wrong place, at the wrong altitude, and were bounced by P-47s that had been hunting for exactly that kind of target. The veterans who survived watched this massacre with numb resignation. They had seen it before. On the Eastern Front, in North Africa, the moment when an air force began to disintegrate, when losses exceeded replacement, when tactical competence eroded, when hope evaporated. The P-47 had not caused this collapse alone. The Mustang was equally important. The strategic bombing campaign, the loss of fuel production, the diversion of resources to air defense. All of these factors contributed, but the Thunderbolt was the symbol. It represented everything the Luftwaffe had believed could not happen. An American fighter that was too heavy, too strange, too different from accepted doctrine, proving superior through brute effectiveness. In September 1944, a captured Luftwaffe pilot was interrogated by American intelligence officers. He was 23 years old. He had been flying combat missions for 8 months. He had claimed 4 victories. His FW-190 had been shot down by a P-47 over Belgium. The interrogation report recorded his assessment of American fighters. He stated that the P-47 was the aircraft German pilots feared most, not because it was faster or more maneuverable, but because it was persistent, because you could never escape it, because it would chase you across half of Germany if necessary and still have fuel to fight. He described missions where German fighters, having survived bomber interceptions, descended to lower altitudes to escape American escorts, and found P-47s waiting below them, already positioned, ready. The Americans, he said, fought like they had infinite resources, infinite fuel, infinite ammunition, infinite patience. And against such an opponent, courage and skill were not enough. The interrogation officer asked if German pilots believed they could still win air superiority. The captured pilot laughed, not with humor, with exhaustion. Air superiority, he explained, had already been lost months ago. The question now was how long German pilots could continue to contest the sky before everyone was dead. The final months of 1944 saw the Luftwaffe attempting strategies born from desperation. Concentrated attacks by large formations of fighters, ramming attacks against bombers, deploying the new Me-262 jet fighters in limited numbers. Anything to disrupt the American bombing campaign, anything to regain the initiative. None of it worked. The P-47 groups adapted to each new tactic. When German fighters massed for concentrated attacks, American escorts positioned themselves to intercept during the formation process. When ramming attacks began, P-47s targeted the ramming aircraft before they could reach the bombers. The Me-262 jets were faster than any piston-engine fighter, but they were few in number, vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and American pilots, including those flying P-47s, quickly learned to patrol near known jet bases, to catch them when they were slow, when their speed advantage did not matter. The technological superiority that German pilots had relied on was gone. The tactical sophistication they had perfected was obsolete, and the psychological advantage of being the best-trained, most experienced fighter force in the world had evaporated. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. By early 1945, the collapse was complete. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Training programs produced pilots with barely enough flight hours to take off and land. Experienced pilots were killed or captured at rates that made replacement impossible. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, but as an effective fighting force, it was finished. The P-47 groups continued their missions: escort, ground attack, armed reconnaissance. The tempo never slowed. If anything, it increased. Because there were more aircraft, more pilots, more missions. German pilots who survived to witness the final months of the war described a surreal experience. Flying obsolete tactics in obsolete aircraft against opponents who controlled the sky absolutely. Taking off knowing you would probably die. But taking off anyway because orders were orders and duty was duty. Some stopped caring about victory, about the strategic situation, about anything except surviving one more mission, one more landing, one more day. The P-47 had become part of the background reality, like the weather, like gravity, something that simply was, that could not be changed or avoided, that killed you if you made mistakes and sometimes killed you even if you did not. When the war ended in May 1945, the 8th Air Force had flown the P-47 on thousands of missions. It had destroyed thousands of German aircraft. It had strafed hundreds of airfields. It had claimed more ground vehicles than any other American fighter. But statistics do not capture what the Thunderbolt actually accomplished. It had broken the psychological dominance of the Luftwaffe. Not through individual superiority, not through elegant tactics or revolutionary technology, but through persistence, through rugged dependability, through being there, mission after mission, day after day, until the Germans stopped believing they could win. The mockery with which German pilots first viewed the P-47 was not based on stupidity or ignorance. Their assessment was tactically sound. A heavy fighter could not dogfight with a Bf-109. The math supported that conclusion. But war is not mathematics. War is logistics, production, training pipelines, strategic endurance, the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting, the capacity to learn and adapt faster than your opponent. The P-47 embodied all of these things. It was not the best fighter because of its specifications. It was the best fighter because of what it represented: American industrial might, tactical flexibility, a willingness to challenge accepted doctrine and build something different. German pilots had learned their craft in the skies over Spain and Poland and France. They had refined their skills against the best fighters Britain could produce. They had every reason to believe that experience and tradition would triumph over industrial excess. The P-47 taught them otherwise. In the years after the war, historians would analyze the air campaign over Europe. They would debate which aircraft was truly superior. They would compare kill ratios and technical specifications and tactical doctrines. But the German pilots who survived rarely participated in these debates. When asked about the P-47, they spoke with a kind of weary respect. It had not been the fastest fighter, not the most maneuverable, not the most elegant or sophisticated, but it had been there, always there, in numbers that made resistance futile, with a persistence that wore down even the most determined opposition. Flown by pilots who learned quickly and fought aggressively and kept coming no matter how many were shot down. The Thunderbolt had proven that doctrinal certainty was a luxury, that assumptions based on past experience could become liabilities, that the nature of warfare could change faster than institutions could adapt. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as the finest air force in the world. Its pilots were skilled, its aircraft were advanced, its tactical doctrine was proven. And it had looked at the P-47 Thunderbolt and seen an absurdity, a joke, an aircraft so obviously wrong that it confirmed American ignorance. But the joke was on them, because while they mocked, the Americans were learning. While they dismissed, American industry was building. While they relied on certainty, their opponents were adapting. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The sky belonged to the Thunderbolt. In warfare, perception shapes reality until reality shatters perception. The German fighter pilots who mocked the P-47 Thunderbolt were not fools. They were professionals, veterans of years of combat, men who understood air warfare at a level most could never achieve. Their mistake was not ignorance, it was certainty. They knew what fighters were supposed to be: light, agile, built for the swirling, turning dogfights that had defined air combat since the First World War. And when they saw an aircraft that violated every principle they held sacred, they dismissed it. They could not imagine that the rules might change, that their experience, their tradition, their proven methods might become obsolete, that an opponent might build something so fundamentally different that comparison became meaningless. The P-47 was not a better Bf-109. It was something else entirely. It represented a different philosophy of warfare, one built around industrial capacity rather than individual craftsmanship, around tactical flexibility rather than doctrinal purity, around winning through persistence rather than elegance. And in the end, that philosophy prevailed. The cost was measured in lives. Tens of thousands of young men, German and American, who died in the skies over Europe, some in burning aircraft, some in crashes, some simply vanishing into clouds and never returning. Each death was a tragedy. Each loss was mourned. But the strategic calculus continued regardless, because modern warfare is not fought between individuals. It is fought between systems, between industrial capacities, between nations willing to pay prices that earlier generations would have found unthinkable. The Luftwaffe could not win that kind of war. They could produce exceptional aircraft, train brilliant pilots, develop sophisticated tactics, but they could not replace losses at American rates, could not absorb defeats and continue fighting, could not adapt faster than the strategic situation deteriorated. The P-47 Thunderbolt, ugly and heavy and wrong by every traditional measure, became the instrument of that defeat. Not because it was invincible, it was shot down by the hundreds, but because behind every loss was another aircraft, another pilot, another mission. The production lines never stopped. The training never ceased. The pressure never relented. German pilots learned to fear not the individual Thunderbolt, but what it represented. The reality that they were fighting an opponent who could afford to make mistakes, who could absorb losses, who would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until the war was over. The broader lesson extends beyond aircraft specifications and tactical doctrines. Certainty is a comfort. It allows us to make sense of complexity, to apply experience, to trust what we know. But certainty can also blind us to change, to new realities that do not conform to our expectations, to threats that do not look like the threats we have faced before. The German pilots who laughed at the P-47 were not laughing at the aircraft itself. They were laughing at the idea that their understanding of warfare might be incomplete, that their opponents might see something they had missed, that the rules they had mastered might not be the only rules, that laughter cost them everything. By the time they recognized their error, the strategic situation had shifted beyond recovery. The sky belonged to aircraft they had dismissed. The initiative had passed to pilots they had underestimated. The war they thought they understood had become something different, and there was no going back. In the spring of 1945, that Luftwaffe pilot who had laughed at the P-47 photographs was dead. He had survived until March, had witnessed the collapse of the Luftwaffe, had flown missions that accomplished nothing except confirming that the war was lost. And on a clear morning over Bavaria, a P-47 had caught him during landing approach. He had no fuel to maneuver, no altitude to dive, no options at all. The Thunderbolt made one pass, 8 machine guns firing in unison, and the joke ended. Across Germany, in prison camps and hospitals and makeshift quarters, surviving Luftwaffe pilots heard of his death. One more name, one more loss, one more pilot who had believed that skill and experience would be enough. They did not laugh anymore. They understood finally what the war had taught them at such terrible cost. That arrogance is a luxury that only the victorious can afford. That tradition is no shield against innovation, that what has always worked will eventually stop working. And that by the time you realize this, it is usually too late. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat mission in August 1945. It had served in every theater, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, changed the nature of fighter combat, and proven that certainty, no matter how well earned, is always provisional. The veterans who flew it would remember it as a reliable, powerful, forgiving aircraft, one that brought them home when others might not have, one that gave them a fighting chance when outnumbered, one that let them make mistakes and survive to learn from them. The veterans who fought against it would remember it differently, as the aircraft they had dismissed, the joke that became a nightmare, the heavy, ungainly machine that should not have worked, but did, as the moment they learned that the world had changed while they were looking the other way. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just an aircraft. It was a lesson in humility, delivered at altitude, at 400 miles per hour, with 8 50 caliber machine guns, to an enemy who learned it far too late.